Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Tom Mortimer. We're at the Cadeau tasting room in Dundee. It's November 29th, 2023. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Rich. Appreciate it.
First question, why wine?
Why wine? Well, you kind of got to go back to probably like maybe the 1980s, and I was in the paper and packaging business. And I went out to meet with a machinery supplier in San Francisco. And he brought a bottle of 1974 Martini Cabernet to dinner. 74 was a fantastic vintage in California. I had no idea about it at the time. To me, it was a bottle of wine with a guy in a restaurant. But it was kind of an aha moment that really caused me to understand that wine was something special. I was probably about 30 at the time, so I wasn't really into wine, but it got my attention. Fast forward a number of years, and I was in more of a sales and marketing role, still in the packaging business, but I was entertaining customers. And if you're entertaining customers, you have the credit card. If you have the credit card, you get the wine list. And I'd look at the wine list, and I was absolutely clueless. So I started studying up on wine, and like many people do, I got hooked and began collecting. This was probably very early 1990-ish. And built a small wine collection and kind of traveled around the world, not literally, but through my bottles of wine, working with various wine regions and figuring out what I liked and didn't like. So really my entree to wine was as a collector. You kind of need to pause that story there and go to the Oregon side of it. And that came about because I had a very good friend. I grew up in the Chicago burbs, and a good friend of mine moved out here and actually was living in Newberg, Oregon, and we came out to visit him. When I say we, it was me and my wife, Deb, came out to visit our good friends here in 1994, and it was a beautiful week in the summer in the Willamette Valley, like only the Willamette Valley can produce. And I fell in love with Oregon, and it was just kind of an amazing thing. He and I ended up buying a small company in Dundee. It had nothing to do with wine, but it was right smack in the middle of wine country, right on 9th Street, heading up the hill into all the vineyards. And I started coming out to Oregon more frequently. I had a full-time job in Minneapolis, but fell in love with Oregon and then began to appreciate Oregon wine. So this would have been around 1995. And at that point in time, really the Oregon focus was more dominant. And I said to my wife, Deb, I'd really like to buy a piece of dirt here, place with a view on a hill. And then I started thinking about what do you do when you sit up on a hill? You can't just sit there all day long going, nice view. So that's when the light bulb came on, and it's like, hey, they grow grapes here and they make wine, and it's good wine, and I collect wine, and I should at least, if I'm going to buy dirt and dirt on a hill, I should buy grape dirt. And at the time I told my wife that it was just a long-term investment, and we'd see how it evolved. What I learned is when you buy grape dirt, it talks, and grape dirt says, "Plant me." And I told my wife that the dirt was talking and that we needed to plant some. And she kind of wondered what happened to the long-term plan, because that was about 6 weeks after I bought the property. So obviously the grape dirt was quite vocal. But we began planting, we cleared the land for 2 years. We bought the property at the beginning of 1997. It was a 28-acre parcel on the south slope of Parrot Mountain, just a few miles to the east of Newberg. Right above the Willamette River, completely forested, never cleared, never cultivated, very, very rocky, broken volcanic basalt soil. The farmer on the hill was kind of laughing at the city people because he knew how much rock was there, and at that time everybody kind of thought it was just suitable at best for fir trees. But we bought it, 28 acres, and began clearing in 1997, cleared it for 2 years, started planting in 1999, and that's how the wine business started.
So back up for a minute. We'll pick it back up there in a second. Let's talk a bit about life before wine. You mentioned growing up in Chicago, the suburbs of Chicago. Tell me about sort of life before wine. What was early life education like, and how did you start into the career you started into?
Interesting. Well, interesting question. It may or may not be interesting to the audience, but that's for you to decide. Chicago burbs, got out of high school, moved to upstate New York, went to school, college there. Got out of school, moved down to Philadelphia to take a job with a paper and packaging company. The company I worked for was mostly hired people out of the military. I was one of the few people that came right out of an undergrad program, and so I found myself in a quasi-stodgy paper company with mostly older people, and I was about 22 years old, and I decided that, if I was going to meet anybody in this new town, I needed to do something other than just work. And so I like to ski, and I found a job at a ski shop. And my future wife, Deb, walked in one day. I sold her a pair of ski boots. And, we ended up getting married a couple years later, and that's how we met up. So we were in Philly for a number of years, and then up in New Jersey. And then the phone rang, and another paper company out in Ohio hired us, and hired me, not us, and we moved to Cincinnati. Did that for a few years, and then the phone rang again, and we ended up taking a job with a leverage buyout company, also paper industry up in Minneapolis, a company by the name of Waldorf Corporation. And we made a lot of packaging for General Mills and Lego toys, and a lot of recycled paper. So during that 10-year run or so, I learned a lot about recycling. And ultimately, the business that my business partner and I bought out here in Dundee was a recycling business. So it was kind of related to that. And that's what it got us all going.
So you mentioned your visit to the Willamette Valley. Tell me about sort of initial impressions of Oregon, and what made this the place you wanted to buy into.
Well, we were living in Minneapolis at the time. They like to say the mosquito is a state bird in Minnesota, and so we were immediately taken by the fact that there weren't any of those critters flying around in the summer. It was like, how did that happen? So that was pretty wonderful. The Midwest is also quite humid and hot and sticky, and of course my wife's from Philly, and the East gets a little bit hot and sticky sometimes. So I was taken by the dry climate out here, which at the time I didn't really understand that that's what grapes like too. So that was great. The hills, the fir trees, there's an ocean nearby. Portland's a pretty neat city. So there was a lot to like about Oregon, the climate, the topography, the weather, the restaurant scene, and then eventually the wine. I think we were, at the time I was in my early 40s and obviously not thinking about retiring, but when you walk outside in Minnesota and it's 20 below zero actual temperature, and you're walking on ice that isn't slippery anymore because it's sticky and creaky, and people are driving their cars on lakes, you kind of don't have to be too smart to figure out that's not a great retirement plan. And so when we discovered Oregon, and of course we hadn't really experienced the rainy winter yet, but we at least knew that the temperatures were sane. As one of my friends from Minnesota said, you don't need to shovel rain. And so it just seemed like a really nice place to orient towards. Having said all of that, my day job was in Minneapolis. And when we ended up buying the property in 1997 and then clearing it for 2 years, we actually developed the vineyard for 12 years, commuting back and forth from Minneapolis. And, I'd leave the office on a Thursday night, get on a plane, we'd fly out here, we'd meet with the cat driver, we'd clear some property, and I'd fly back on Sunday afternoon, and I'd be in my office Monday morning. And we did that for the better part of 12 years. We did eventually build a small home on the vineyard so that I could hang out there when we were out here. But it was kind of, my wife said, I'm not moving until you show me that this is real. And obviously when you start a vineyard from raw ground, it's kind of an 8-year open wallet experience. All you do is spend money for 8 years, and there's no income. And I learned very early on that unlike, for example, selling a building or even a packaging idea, if somebody's going to sell a building, they draw a picture and they show you what the building's going to look like. Same thing with packaging. You can bring in a sample box and find out if that's what the customer wants. You can't do that with wine. I had friends in the wine business that were distributors, and I went to them and I said, hey, I'm building this vineyard in Oregon, we're going to make great Pinot Noir, would you represent me? And they said, Tom, I know you got a good palate, you like wine, I'm sure you'll make a great product. When you've got wine, come show it to me and I'll let you know. And, people want to taste it, and rightfully so. And so you can't really build much of a sales plan while you're building out a vineyard. So not only do you spend the 8 years clearing the ground, getting the vines in, getting the grapes to grow, and then ultimately getting it into a bottle, and then you put it in a warehouse and you kind of wait while you sell bottle number 1 and then bottle number 2. And you build the business slowly over a period of time. So we didn't actually move to Oregon until 2009. So, we're looking at, again, 12 years of commuting and building the wine business and the vineyard on the side while I continued to do my day job.
So you mentioned sort of your wine education and building a palate, building a cellar. Tell me about learning about wine and what drew you in? What excited you about learning wine?
Well, I think there's a lot of people in the world, and maybe you can divide them into a few categories. One is, people that just don't drink wine. Or they're occasional wine drinkers. Then there are people who do drink wine, but they don't really think about wine. It's another beverage. And then you get into people that take wine seriously. And, if you subdivide those groups, there are a lot of people in that group that they kind of want to be told what good wine is. They look for a recommendation from a sommelier, they look for a recommendation from a wine critic, whoever they follow. And if somebody says this is what good wine is, whether it got a 95-point score or an enthusiastic friend brought it over and you try it and you like it and you decide that's what you like for good wine. But I think there's a point where your palate evolves and you begin to think for yourself about what is it that's really compelling about wine and what is it that you're looking for, and do you or don't you agree with certain critics, and initially if you don't agree you feel like you're wrong because they're critics and they are supposed to know what they're doing. I think over time you develop the confidence to say, it's okay to disagree with a critic. They have a palate, I have a palate, and we're not seeing the same thing. That's not to say that there isn't good wine and that there isn't bad wine. Clearly there are both. But within the context of good wine, a critic can certainly prefer one, and I think a consumer can prefer another, and that's okay. In terms of my interest, I think wine can just do something special at any given moment. It may be a food pairing. I to this day, I remember a bottle of Syrah that I had with a Hungarian mushroom soup that was crazy good. And I'm not a big Syrah drinker, but that one particular food pairing was just fantastic. And so I think there's wines that we all encounter if you get serious about wine, and it speaks to you in sort of a special way. It elevates your palate. It just kind of says, I'm special, I'm different, and pay attention. And I think that is clearly what happened. And then, earlier on, I would find, again, in the context of entertaining customers, I'd go out to a restaurant and, I'd get a wine list and I'd buy an old bottle of wine and it wouldn't be very good. And I'd buy an expensive bottle of wine and it wouldn't be very good. And, then randomly I'd come across a bottle of wine that I thought was really great. And so understanding there's got to be some rhyme or reason to it and figuring out what that was, it clearly wasn't just price point and age. There were other things going on in the wine world that defined what ultimately made a good bottle of wine and didn't.
So you've gotten the property and the dirt starts talking to you and telling you that it's time to plant. So at that point, how prepared did you feel for undertaking that kind of process, and what was your vision for what the place would look like?
Well, two very, very different questions. Let me do the second one first. The vision was that I really wanted to create an environment that was pleasing to be in. I think initially I saw the vineyard as a piece of landscaping to some extent, not to trivialize it. I mean, it was obviously a vineyard and there were wine aspirations. But the big role was, if you're coming from suburbia, and you want to put in a lawn, you call the sod guy and he puts in a lawn and you've got a lawn in a few days, and you put in some bushes and, your house is landscaped. When you buy 28 acres of completely raw ground that's got second growth fir stumps, scrub maples, blackberry bushes, poison oak, piles of rocks, and there is no view because all of this brush is obscuring the view, and you start thinking about how do you landscape 28 acres of property. You don't do that with shrubs and bushes and sod, and so it was clear that a vineyard would play an important cosmetic part of the property. And I think initially, again, what really drew us to Oregon was Oregon. And so the first vision was to build a beautiful place, build a place that we wanted to be. A lot of the time we get asked questions, why did we leave the fir trees in the middle of the vineyard here and over here? And we left them there because they look good. And the original people said, well, you're going to want to take them out because the birds are going to sit in the trees, they're going to come down, they're going to eat the fruit, and you know what? They were right. But we developed a very aggressive bird control program because we like the trees. And so our real goal was to build a very, very beautiful place to be. What I didn't fully understand and appreciate at the time, I think, going back 25 years ago, biodynamic and organic were less prevalent, certainly in the mainstream. And, now you hear the term biodiversity quite a bit. And when we bought our property, we had all kinds of biodiversity. Poison oak that I learned to respect and appreciate far too many times. Fantastic fir trees, of course, but we had wild irises growing on the property, and just all kinds of stuff. And when you clear raw ground, of course, all the seeds get in the soil, and then in your second, third, and fourth year, you discover what was growing there naturally, and so we ended up with all kinds of stuff, especially like thistles, and so. I think that there's this evolutionary process that you go through, understanding and building the vineyard. So, we started out cosmetically, looking for a beautiful place to be. Aspirationally, from a wine business standpoint, as a collector, and also as a business person who traveled a lot, I had a fairly keen awareness that there were wineries all over the country. And I don't mean to, disparage lesser wine regions, because, there are people that make some interesting wines and they can be good wines. But most of the time those regions don't make great wines. And as a collector, I had a desire to make great wine. I was never about being the winery that was, close to the city that made most of their money from doing weddings. It's fine. It's a good business model, but I wasn't really looking for a business model. I was looking for a very, more of an art form, more of a, I just had I had another job, I had another business, and so the wine business for me was less about the business and it was more about the art of trying to make great wine. What I knew from our due diligence on the property, actually kind of a funny story, at the very beginning, 1997, I hired a cat driver to clear the property. And I was in Minneapolis, and so I'd hired him by phone, and we'd kind of traded some diagrams, and I said, if you could kind of clear this little area up where we plan to put the house, it'd be nice to sort of see what's there. And he said, okay, I'll get in there a couple days before you come out for Memorial Day 1997, and we can take a look at it. So he did that. I met him, and we stood up on the road before we really went down to look at it. And he made the comment, he liked to call me Tommy, and he said, Tommy, I gotta tell you something. I couldn't sleep last night, and I hesitate to tell you this because a guy could lose a good job over what I'm gonna say, but I just couldn't sleep. And I feel like I gotta let you know, if I was you, I would hire a guy like me to clean this place up a little bit, and I'd go buy a piece of ground with some dirt on it. And that's a true story. That's how we started. John was the first of 3 cat drivers. The second cat driver, Jerry, came in, and he'd call me up, and I'd say, how's it going? He'd go, oh, my kitty's getting all beat up on these rocks. And, finally the third cat driver came in and actually finished it up. But the rocks are brutal, and we learned a lot about rocks, and we learned a lot about development, and but to your question about the vineyard aspirations, what I knew from wine collecting is that a lot of the best wines in the world are grown on rocky soils. Whether you're looking at the Rhone or Spain or Burgundy, there's rocks, and over the years I've learned why. I don't think I understood it at the beginning. I knew I didn't understand it at the beginning. I just knew that there was a correlation between good vineyards, good grapes, good wine, and rocks. And so that's been a learning experience. But, aspirationally, my hope was that we could make a very, very high quality Pinot Noir product. But also, we were buying property that wasn't surrounded by vineyards. If you buy a piece of dirt that's right next to somebody who's been farming that dirt for 20 years, there's a pretty good chance you can go try their wine and you're going to get a strong indication of what that dirt's going to do. I asked my first vineyard manager, how do you know when you're developing a vineyard from scratch, whether you're creating a Grand Cru vineyard or you're building a complete dud? And she said, well, it's pretty easy. I said, okay, tell me now, would you? She goes, well, you plant it and you wait 10 years. And, I think really that's kind of what you have to do. I have seen sites that looked like they should have been fantastic. And, they weren't bad, but they weren't fantastic. and you just you have to work with the land, and frankly, you have to be a little bit lucky.
So you mentioned how long it took to get this cleared and get this ready. So tell me about that sort of time for you. Did you remain confident this would work? Were there times when you wished you hadn't done it? Where were you kind of mentally as the process was going on in the 90s and 2000s?
So, yeah, probably the best way to illustrate that was we bought the property in 97, cleared it for 2 years. We started planting in 99, which meant that we would have had small vines and grow tubes in the ground 1999. They would have been a year old in 2000, 2 years old in 2001. And again, I mentioned the 8-year sort of out-of-pocket adventure that you take on when you start building a vineyard from scratch on raw ground. And we were about 5 years into it. And by that time, we'd built a small house in the vineyard, and I was up there writing a bunch of checks for different services, things we'd done. And my wife said, you know, all you ever do is write checks. Nothing ever comes out of this place. It's really just a black hole. And I said, yeah, you're right. You know, I said, that's kind of got a nice ring to it. Why don't, you know, what I had learned from my accountant is that there's value in having a farming business that is separate, separate from a wine business. And so we had actually 2 companies where you grow the fruit in one company and you sell the fruit to the other company. I thought, you know, why don't we call it Black Hole Vineyard? And so we did. And then I started worrying a little bit that might be kind of a red flag for the IRS. And so I pulled it down to BHV LLC, which we work with to this day. But if you find one of the earlier vineyard maps that were printed of the valley back when there were very relatively few vineyards, I think Tina's used to have one hanging on the wall. I don't know if it's still there. If you look at the south slope of Parrot Mountain where we are, you will see a vineyard labeled Black Hole. And that was courtesy of my wife watching me write checks. I'm reminded of another time where what would happen is, because we were in Minneapolis, we'd visit the vineyard, we'd fly home, we'd come back. We're up on a hill, it's fairly windy. The initial plantings, we had bamboo stakes that were too thin with grow tubes that were too tall. And so when you put tall grow tubes on a thin stake and the wind blows, it breaks the stakes off. And so we would go back to Minneapolis and we'd come back 2 weeks or a month later, and all the baby grapevines would be laying on the ground, you know, inside the grow tube. And one of the things I've learned over the years is grapes are pretty durable, and you can set them back up. But of course, we would come back not knowing anything about planting a vineyard, and we'd be somewhat horrified to see all of our little grapevines laying on their sides, thinking that they were dead, and I didn't realize at the time they were just sleeping. And so I needed to wake them up, and we got them all going, and life was good. But, it was around that time where I had some visitors come, and I sort of, shook my head and I said, yeah, I don't know if this is a good idea or not. But I said, one of the problems that I have is, what do you do in life when you sell the vineyard? And I think that's a big problem. If you're into grapes and you're into wine and you're taking on a project like this, there aren't a whole lot of things you can do that are really more exciting than that. I've owned a couple of small businesses. I've worked in companies. Some have been successful, some have been unsuccessful. I've, sold good stuff. I've had good orders. None of that is anywhere near as exciting and intriguing and engaging as trying to make world-class wine. Because Mother Nature throws you a curveball. Every year you get a new pitch. And you have to try to figure out how to hit it. And the experience helps a lot, because sometimes, she throws a pitch that's kind of like the pitch she threw before, and you kind of see it coming. The first 10 years or 15 years going around, they're all new pitches, and you don't see patterns too much. But it makes every year new and exciting, and that is fun. I found in a lot of my other business activities that I would get excited at the beginning, and then I'd lose interest, and my attention span, over an extended period of time was limited. It became more routine, and to this day, really, we're over 25 years in the vineyard development process, and we just had our 20th anniversary at the wine level. People ask me, how long have you been in the business? And I go, well, if you ask my wife, it's when I wrote the first check. So from my wife's perspective, we've been in the business, 26 years now. If you want to know when I sold my first bottle of wine, that was 8 years later, so we've been in the wine marketing business for, 18 coming on 20 years. And if you look at it from a winemaking standpoint, it's 20 years. So, over time, you learn some things. But what I've really learned is that it's a unique business. It's not all fun and games. There are ups and downs and problems and issues, and you have to deal with those. And when you sell wine, it's very, very transactional. In my other jobs, I'd get on the phone with a big company, DuPont, and we'd talk for an hour, and I'd get an order for 2 truckloads, and we'd send out $80,000 worth of product. In the wine business, you get on the phone and talk for 2 hours, and somebody maybe buys a $25 bottle, or maybe not. And so it's a very different kind of a business, but it's engaging. And I think, from a vision standpoint, my hope was to do something great that people would appreciate, that would also be true to the land, that would be, vineyard derived. And we've done a number of things in the vineyard to try to bring that into reality.
Well, let's talk about that next. So obviously the vineyard took time to take shape. So tell me about the decisions you made to plant what you planted, where you planted it, and then sort of getting to know the vineyard as it started to mature.
So making the transition from a wine collector to a grape grower, especially when you have no farming or viticultural background or education or experience. I mean, my degree was in economics, and it has very little to do with Black Hole Vineyard. Obviously, it's kind of the complete opposite. I did what a lot of people do that come to the industry with passion and enthusiasm and complete ignorance. In that I relied on thoughts and opinions from winemakers and friends that I had gotten to know as I'd traveled to Oregon and collected wine and tried their wines. I hired people that knew what they were doing, whether it be clearing or planting or viticulture. There's a point in a vineyard that's a lot like the evolution of a palate on the wine side, where I was talking about developing your own palate and your own opinions and being okay in disagreeing with people. And initially, I would talk with a lot of winemakers, and I'd say, if you're planting a vineyard, what clones would you plant? And what spacing would you use? And, just kind of picking their brains. And my approach to that was, if I heard the same thing 5 times from 5 people, I took it as pretty much truth and knowledge, something that, was generally accepted practice. If I heard, 3 different things from 5 people, I took it as opinion. And that was open to debate and something to be studied further and learned. When I talked with people about spacing of vine rows, the old footprint in Oregon, vine rows would be quite wide. I don't know, 9 feet maybe, something like that, to get a great big honking tractor through. And the vines in the vine row were 5-6 feet apart maybe. I think early spacing footprints were maybe 800-900 vines to the acre. I don't know exactly, but fairly spaced out. And then there were, of course, a few people, by that time I had met, for example, John Thomas, who was early on and had planted 1 meter by 1 meter. And, but I talked with some other people that had had a little bit of experience with meter by meter. When Domaine Drouin came in, they put in meter by 1 meter because that's what you do in Burgundy. And there were some folks who said that for Oregon's humidity and a variety of issues. I mean, for example, if you do meter by 1 meter, your vines need to be kept very short. If you keep the vines short to have the proper leaf area, you got to have your wire very close to the ground. If the wire is very close to the ground, all your workers have to bend over. And, people were saying it's kind of hard to get people excited about picking fruit that's 1 foot off the ground. And so there were some practical considerations that were emerging from people who had worked with some of the more extreme footprints in either direction. I pretty much settled on what seems to have become a standard, which is 5 by 7. 7 feet between the vine rows and 5 feet between the vines within the row. But, I kind of took a slightly whimsical and arguably stupid approach. I figured since the plants were ultimately French, they would be more comfortable with a metric system. So we ended up planting 2 meters by 1.5 meters, just to confuse everybody. So we're actually around 6 3/4 by 4 and some feet. And the vines were happy. They've never actually told me that, but I just kind of sensed that they liked being on a metric footprint. And practically speaking, when we look out, 20 years later, we have, 2 meters by 1.5 meters translates to 1,349 vines per acre. 5 by 7 is in the neighborhood of 1,250, I think, something like that. So there's like 8% more vine density in 2 meters by 1.5 meters. And that's served us well. Sometimes, you get a little bit more fruit from the ground. Where we have thin soils with the rock, sometimes the vines won't fill up the distance on the wire, so having everything a little bit tighter has worked out well. But then you get into the question of what to plant. And so, I've answered the question of the configuration. When I talk to people about clonal material, back then, of course, the two traditional, let's call them stalwart heirloom clones or selections were Pommard and Wädenswil. And, with a heavy bias going towards Pommard, but with a number of proponents for Wädenswil. And by that time, the Dijon clones had come into the Oregon system, if you will, primarily the 113, 114, 115 series. When we planted the 667 and 777 were just coming in. I don't hear it too much, but somebody once referred to them as the Boeing clones because they sound like airplanes. And I just kind of liked that. So we were fortunate to get a hold of the so-called Boeing clones very early on. And I worked with Alan Holstein, who had been farming with Argyle and Domaine Drouin, and he was able to provide some plant material. I remember having a conversation with Alan about road direction. We talked about the footprint and the spacing, and I kind of settled on that. And I talked about planting north and south, and Alan said to me, "Have you ever been to Burgundy?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, if you go to Burgundy and you look at all the Grand Cru vineyards, you'll find that the rows are planted in every sort of direction, every which way." And he said, "You know, I've heard the theory that you want to plant north-south so that you get equal sun exposure on both sides of the vine. But," he said, "when I went to Burgundy, I could tell you that those vines didn't read that book. And they make really great fruit." So, you know, Alan's view at the time was, yeah, I mean, road directions we're thinking about, but he pointed to a number of real-world examples where Grand Cru fruit was produced from road directions that were other than north-south. So I think that was kind of interesting. When I did the survey of the winemakers, everybody pretty much agreed that Pommard was a rock star, and so Pommard figured into what we wanted to plant. At the time, rootstocks, 3309 and 10114 were sort of the typical low vigor rootstocks to plant. RG, Riparia Gloire, was, I think, increasingly becoming popular, but it was described to me as not being very drought tolerant and growing in rocky soils. That never seemed like a really great idea. So our initial plantings were the Boeing clones, 667 and 777, and Pommard on 10114 and 3309. What I found, though, you know, I mentioned how you, as a wine taster, your palate evolves, but in vineyard development, I think your knowledge and your interests and your curiosity also evolves much the way your palate evolves. And what I was finding is that when you work with vineyard management companies, they rightfully are risk adverse. You know, they don't want a client coming in from Minneapolis or Chicago or whatever, and they say, you know, build me a vineyard. And then they come back a month later and go, "I'm sorry, it died." You know, that's not a good message, you know. Or, gee, you know, 5 years later, yeah, you know, we thought at the time we'd try all these different clones and rootstocks, and, you know, the problem is they're not setting any fruit, or they set too much fruit and it's all awful and it's not getting right. I mean, if you're a vineyard management company, those are messages that you don't want to deliver to your client. And so as a result, you tend to get, if you're relying on people that have a need to give you something that's predictable, you tend to get standard things that are predictable. And that can be a very, very good thing. Predictability can be really good, especially when you're spending a lot of time and money. And, you know, with vineyards, you don't get to change it quickly. I mean, we have changed some things, but, you know, it's like my original vineyard manager said, you plant it and you wait 10 years. So you don't make changes quickly. And when you do, they're expensive on a lot of different ways, lost production. And so you want to play the game intelligently, but then, you know, there's this thing in the back of your head that says, but wait a minute, if you're trying to make the best wine, you know, what are they growing to make Grand Cru Burgundy? What, you know, are they planting the same clones, or, you know, how does that work? Why are these wines selling for $5,000 a bottle, other than the fact that, you know, they've been working on it for 500 years and they've got an insane reputation and they don't make very much? But I think you kind of have to ask that question. If your aspirations are high, the question needs to become, will vanilla get you there? And I ran into that problem probably about 5, 6, 7 years into the process, where it was very clear that we were planting the same rootstocks, farming them the same way with the same clones of Pinot Noir that everybody else was farming. And yet when I looked out at a number of producers that I truly admired, they weren't necessarily doing that. I'm not saying they weren't, but they were doing some other things. And I began a quest that I guess turned into an adventure, that sort of turned into a philosophy, and ultimately turned into grapes and wine. And that was, I was finding that a lot of the wines that I really enjoyed personally were not made from the typical Dijon Pommard combinations. You know, Pommard has sort of this reputation of being this fantastic clone, and we made some wine for a client once that said, I just want Pommard. I want 100% Pommard. And I said, okay, you know, so we picked Pommard for her, and we fermented, and we had it in barrel, and brought her over, and I said, okay, here's 100% Pommard. Here's Pommard blended with some other clones. Oh, well, yeah, let's not make all Pommard. Let's make a blended clone wine. And so, you know, and of course we experimented with, you know, fermenting clones individually, a la Pommard, or, you know, 66777, to kind of understand what their identities were. But then we also began fermenting mixed clones, clonal diversity in single fermenters, and you know, we just consistently found that co-fermented clones were more interesting than individual clones, and even if you were to replicate the exact, you know, let's just say you did a third, Pommard 667, 777, and you fermented them separately, and then you brought them all together, a third. I don't know that I've ever actually run that test, but my perception is that if you put a third of the fruit in the fermentation tank and you co-ferment them, you'll end up with a better wine than you will if you do it at the winemaker level where you bring them all together. And so there were some learning curves there, but also I think the wines that I was really liking were a lot of wines that were coming from the Sonoma Coast in California, and were being made by people that had emerging reputations that were large. You know, Ted Lemon at Literai, and, you know, not so much in Pinot, but guys like David Ramey and Eric Sussman at Radio Cadeau, and you know, I always liked Joe Swan, Rob Berglund were making great wines, Steve Kistler. And so there were a lot of things happening in California that to me were interesting, and I started going down to California. I had the good fortune of, actually back in Minneapolis, a friend of mine who was a wine collector convinced David Ramey that it was a good idea to come to Minneapolis and do a wine dinner. And my friend Craig thought it would be a good idea if he sat me next to David at the wine dinner, which probably wasn't a good idea for David, because every time he tried to take a bite of food, I'd ask him a question, and it was usually a viticultural question. And I remember he brought a bottle of Cabernet called Pedregal, which of course is rock related, and to me that was very interesting. We were talking about that particular vineyard, but he said, you really need to meet a guy who's my viticulturalist, a guy by the name of Daniel Roberts. And Daniel has a couple of PhDs. He's a controversial character down in the California wine scene. There's people who just think Daniel's amazing and love him, and he's got many, many, many great friends. There are a handful of people that you know, Daniel's not without his opinions, and there are people who've had other opinions, and so they maybe don't agree as much. And so, but Daniel's from Connecticut. When we met him, David introduced us. He kind of looks like Moses with shorts, and he in sneakers. At least that's how I envisioned Moses would look. I don't know how Moses actually looked. I never really met him, but Daniel, being from Connecticut, I think hit it off pretty well. With my wife being from Philly, they kind of spoke the same sort of Eastern dialect, I think, and so we became pretty good friends. And he introduced me to a whole lot of people. Larry Hyde, Rod Berglund, a number of winemakers. Of course, Daniel had a lot of knowledge himself. And ultimately, what we ended up doing is planting what I refer to as heritage clones. And, these were different selections of Calera, Swan, Mount Eden, Hansel. Of course, the big challenge, Oregon has always been fanatical, rightfully so, about having clean plants. And so the challenge was, how do we find these old clones and find clean representations of them that were still accurate and, true to what they, true to the clones that they actually are, which is to say that they hadn't been processed so much in the lab that you weren't quite sure that what you were getting was really a distant relative of what you thought you were getting. So that began a long adventure to acquire those different clones, and we ultimately planted them. I didn't know how they would do. And so, as I spoke to the idea that, vineyard management companies like predictability, 5, 6, 7 years into it, around 2006, 7, after I was doing all the research on the heirloom clones or the heritage clones, we moved into this phase of unpredictability where we were bringing up plant material that had not been widely planted in Oregon, and began a whole new learning curve. Daniel also imparted some ideas on how to clear and prep rocky soil, ripping on vine rows, which was something that when I first did it, Matt Peel said, well, I've heard about doing that, and we thought about doing it once, or maybe he said we did it once, but you would, at most, you would be the second person to do it. And so we laid out a piece of the vineyard. We chalked out the vine rows like you would with a baseball diamond, where you put chalk down. And then we brought a big cat in with a big shank, and we ripped right on the vine row. Because there's so much rock that if you did traditional ripping, you'd just end up with a quarry. So, we ripped on the vine row, which cuts a nice trench, and then you get all the boulders, I call them dinosaur eggs. You get the dinosaur eggs out of the trench, you backblade it, and you come back and you plant on the vine row, and then you end up with plants that all grow the same because you haven't planted them on top of a dinosaur egg. And right next to it, we have a block where we didn't do that, and it looks kind of flea-bitten because there are, vines that are planted on top of big rocks. So a lot of learning going on there, but I would say a major evolution from the, hey, build me a vineyard, I'm the guy from out of town, to then beginning to understand that we were doing everything exactly like everybody else was doing it. And then the wine collector in me sort of began to question, are we really on a trajectory to make the very best possible wine that we can make? And that really led me to some other places and different plant material, different planting, different farming, and then ultimately some changes in the winemaking front.
So you mentioned that kind of evolution of the vineyard part. Tell me about the wine as you started to make it. What were you seeing in the initial results of the wine, and how involved were you in the winemaking? What was sort of the process of making the wine like at that point?
So, of course, during the first 12 years, we were commuting back and forth, and I had transitioned fairly early on from a corporate job to my own business. So I had the ability to play hooky, which meant that I could be here for harvest. But the reality is kind of shows you how bright we are. We were still living in Minnesota, and so we would come to Oregon for the summer and go back to Minnesota for the winter. Yeah, I know, kind of dumb as a stone, but we would go through harvest, and then we'd go back to Minnesota, which meant that the winemaking, by and large, was left in the hands of my winemakers. What we had evolved into was a winemaking platform that was comparatively unique. Because of the variability of the clones and the soils and the aspect in the vineyard, the east side was quite cool. The west side was very rocky. We had a lot of clonal diversity. Our initial winemaker, 2002 and 2003, we made wine at DuPont. Isabelle Dutart was our winemaker, and Isabelle was fantastic and made some great wine for us in 02 and 03, and we just made one wine. Beginning in 04, a couple things happened. DuPont was filling up, and Scott and Ray Baldwin said, we can't really make all your wine. We don't have space. And so I began to reach out and look for some other folks to make wine. And I had developed friendships with some really great winemakers. Harry Peterson Nedry at Chehalem had become a good friend and a bit of a mentor. Josh Bergstrom, I was introduced to by Sam Tannehill and his wife Cheryl Francis. I had met Cheryl when she was at Chehalem, and then she married Sam, and through Cheryl I met Sam, and through Sam I met Josh. And so initially I talked with Cheryl and Sam about making my wine beginning in 2004, and they were just getting started with their brands, A to Z and Francis Tannehill, and their projects that they were doing. And they were enthusiastic, and they said, sure, we'd love to make your wine. And then they called about a month later, and they said, we just did our production plan, and we don't have space to make all your wine. We can make one tank. And I said, okay, do you have any other ideas as to who might also make some wine for me? And they said, well, why don't you talk to our friend Josh Bergstrom? And, Josh was just getting started, and I went to see Josh. And he said, well, I'm interested. I'd like to make your wine, but we're thinking about building out our barrel room, and the family hasn't made a decision on that yet. And if we do, then yes, I'll have space. But if we don't, then I won't be able to do it because I won't have space. And I said, well, when are you going to know? And he said, about a month. And I said, okay. So I was out ahead of it enough that a month wasn't a huge problem. But during the course of waiting a month, I went to my friend Harry and said, hey, Harry, I know you don't make wine for other people, but I wouldn't want to have my fruit go to someplace else. And Harry had been very, very helpful at the beginning when I was looking at the site, and he was excited about the rocks, and we went walking through the trees and just looked at test holes before anything was even cleared. And Harry had given me some guidance. And so I said, before I send my fruit to somebody else, I wouldn't want you to wish that you maybe could have made some wine for me. So I'm expecting you to say no, but I'm asking if you want to make some. He goes, well, you're right. I don't make wine for other people, but I'll make an exception because I'm really curious about the rocks. And so let's make a tank. Literally the next day, Josh Bergstrom called and said, hey, we're building our barrel room. We'll make all your wine. I said, well, I just agreed to make a tank with Sam and a tank with Harry, and I can do 2 tanks with you. Okay, we'll do 2 tanks. So I ended up with Harry Peterson Nedry, Sam Tannehill, and Josh Bergstrom making wine for me beginning in 2004. And then the next question was, which parts of the vineyard do you guys want and why? And I expected to have a train wreck, and what really happened was just incredible serendipity. In 04, we were just coming off of 03, It's funny how that works. And one of my smarter statements. And yeah, tune in. You can get some other wisdom here. And then we had '05. So we were just coming off of '03. And '03 was a very, very warm vintage. And Josh said, I like the fact that you're higher elevation. We're up between 600 and 750 feet. And it'll be cooler. And he said, I'd like the coolest part of the vineyard. I like the idea of long hang time and slower ripening. I said, okay, well, that'll be the east side because we have trees all along the eastern edge up over there, and you can see the shadow coming down. Maybe. I think it's in there. And that shades the vineyard in the morning, and so it's the cooler part of the vineyard, and we created a cuvee from that section called Côte Est, east side, and Josh Bergstrom made that wine beginning in 2004. Then I went to Harry, and I said, what do you want? And he said, I want the rocks. And the rocks are on the west side, and so we created a cuvee called Rochot, literally rocks. And then I went to Sam, and I figured he was going to either want rocks or cold, and he said, I think what you're doing with all your diverse clones is really interesting, and I want the maximum number of clones that you can give me. And so there's a block up on the north side over here above the house that has 5 clones on 4 rootstocks and another clone on each side. And so we created a cuvee called Diversité, which is a diverse mix of actually 7 clones on 5 rootstocks in 3 different parcels. One faces east, one faces southwest, and one is south. So it's a diverse mix of clones, soils, rootstocks, and aspect. And that all went into Diversité. And so I had these 3 great winemakers working with 3 different parts of the vineyard. And it was a great way to get started. It was great to work with a range of incredible talent because while they had some overlap, they also had different ways of doing things. Harry, for example, I learned very early on, if you had a rainstorm coming in and the fruit was 90% of the way there, Harry would typically be biased in favor of fruit integrity. He didn't want to bring in a bunch of mush with waterlogged fruits and popped berries and all of the issues you get into when it rains. Oppositely, I found that Sam was probably at the other end of the spectrum, and Sam was all about ripe tannins and hang time. Again, now I'm back in, 2004 vintage, so we're looking back 20 years. I don't know to what extent Sam and Harry and Josh have fine-tuned and adjusted. 20 years is a long time, but going back then, there was a time where, of course, I was an anxious newbie grower making wine, and, I wanted to get the fruit ripe, but Harry had already picked, and so I thought, well, okay, if Harry said it's ripe, it should be ready, and I called Sam up, and I said, hey, I think, we could pick your section, and he came up and he looked at it and he goes, oh, no, it's not ready. I mean, you need another at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. And that seemed like eternity when you're watching, leaves turn yellow and fall off the vines and rain is knocking on the door and things like that, and especially when you've already had another really good winemaker pick. And so I called Sam back about a week later and I said, Sam, there's one section down in the rocks, and I said, I kind of think we're ready to pick because all the leaves have fallen off the vines. And there's just these grape clusters hanging there like ornaments. And Sam, in probably one of the classic, understatements, said, yeah, well, if the leaves are gone, we're probably done. And so we got around to picking that fruit. But, but it was great early on learning from, again, 3 really good winemakers that there's different ways of doing things, and that there's not necessarily a right way. There are a lot of stylistic ways, and they lead you to different places. And it was great for me to work with these guys for a number of years because I learned a lot from all of them. When you fast forward to the 07, 08 time frame, and Harry was working with Bill Stoller by that time and had a lot going on, and they were running out of space. Josh was building a good reputation and ramping up his own brand, and he was running out of space, and he tossed all of his clients out at the end of 07. Sam had started A to Z, Rex Hill, and they were ramping up and, making a couple hundred cases for, look at it, excuse me, making a couple hundred cases for Le Cadeau was not in the cards for any of them. And so from 07 to 08, we turned over all of our winemakers. And I had met through a mutual friend, had met Jim Sanders, who learned all of his winemaking from Mike Etzel at Beaufrere. Jim's actually a clinical psychologist by day, and I think a parent, a husband, and a father by night and weekend, and in between that he figures out how to make quite a bit of wine. And but we started working together when Jim was really just getting going back in 03 or 04 when he worked with Mike at Beaufrere. He had made a little bit of wine that was his own, and I tried a bottle of that, and I liked it, and I said, well, why don't we make a tank together? And so we started working together in 06, and then when Josh and Harry and Sam all departed in 7 and 8, Jim took on a slightly bigger portion. But about the same time, early on in my wine collecting days, I had gone down to California and visited Martinelli. Not the Martinelli sparkling people, but the Martinelli people that are fantastic multiple generation growers in Healdsburg, and had met, had been introduced through a wine shop in Minneapolis to Steve Ryan, who was their original winemaker. And Steve was from Minnesota and had migrated to California right after getting out of University of Minnesota and was making wine there. And he was the first winemaker at Martinelli back around 93, 94. Excuse me. And the Martinelli family had hired Helen Turley to be their consultant. And so Steve and Helen were really the people that put Martinelli on the map. I had coincidentally bumped into Steve back in Minnesota at the wine shop that had introduced us, and I brought in a handful of our 04 Pinots that we had just bottled, and I was tasting them with the wine shop manager, and Steve walked in. He was back in Minneapolis for the holidays, and he really liked the Pinot. And he said, yeah, I really like making Pinot. He had left Martinelli by that time and was doing his own biodynamic project down in Mendocino. And he said, I really miss making Pinot. I'd love to make Pinot. And I went back to Oregon, and about 3 weeks later, Josh told me that he couldn't make wine for me. And the others were beginning to unravel as well. And so I called Steve up and I said, if I can get the fruit down to you in California, would you make one of my cuvées? And by that time I had kind of gotten accustomed to the idea that Côte Est was Côte Est and Diversité was Diversité and Rochot was Rochot. And so I shipped fruit down to Steve in California beginning in 2007, and he started making Côte Est in California. And continued to do that for a number of years. Jim Sanders took over a couple of cuvées, and we also created another one. And then when I started moving Steve's fruit to California, I met Jacqueline Yoakum, who had been Ted Lemon's assistant at Literai. And Jacqueline had left Literai, and I asked her if she would want to make some wine. And she said, sure. And since I had learned how to ship fruit to California from Steve, I just put another truck together and sent it to Jacqueline. And so Jacqueline took over Richaud that Harry had made, and Steve took over Code S that Josh had made. And then Diversité, I ended up moving to Scott Schull at Raptor Ridge. And so Scott made Diversité. Jim Sanders was making a cuvée that was a newly producing part of the vineyard that we called Equinox. And so I had the 4 winemakers then. And then being ever curious, in 2008, Tony Reinders left Domaine Serene. And we decided to collaborate on a project that I named Serendipity. And we created another cuvée called Serendipity in 2008 that was from a particular part of the vineyard that Tony made. So in 2008, we peaked at 5 winemakers, but all of them were in their own way either current or emerging rock stars in the wine world. I mean, they were fantastic winemakers. And again, it was an opportunity to learn more and more and more from each of these individuals. And I found, working with Steve and Jacqueline in California, we got away from a little bit of what makes Oregon great, which is the collaborative nature. But one of the downsides of the collaborative nature is that you tend to get a lot of the same ideas in Oregon. And so by making some wine in California, we were getting some other ideas that were coming from, people that were running in different circles and being influenced in different ways. I fairly quickly learned that 5 winemakers is too many, but we did it for a couple of years, and it was interesting. And then over the years, we pared it down, and ultimately, we've divided the different cuvées between Steve Ryan and Jim Sanders, and Steve and Jim and I have worked together since 2006, 2007, so coming close to 20 years now. In 2014, Steve moved to Oregon, which made it a lot easier to ship fruit to him. I only have to ship it to McMinnville, which is great. And they each divide the cuvées between them. Steve makes Code S. We do an entry wine called Red Label. Steve makes that wine. We began making some sparkling in 2011. Steve makes the sparkling. We began producing Chardonnay in 2017. Jim Sanders makes the Chardonnay. I worked with Scott Schull through 2014. And then Jim took over making Diversité. Jacqueline Yoakum made Richaud from 2008 through 12, and then Jim took over Richaud in 2013. I mentioned earlier the heritage or the heirloom clones. We've kept those largely as a separate cuvée. They were planted differently. We changed the spacing a little bit. We did the ripping on the vine rows. We went from 2 meters to 1 meter. Still metric, so the plants were happy. But, we went from 1.5 meters down to 1 meter, so around 2,100 vines to the acre. And the heirloom clones, and Daniel Roberts had encouraged us to try some different rootstocks. 420A, low vigor, tight spacing, works well. Horrible for grafting, but interesting to grow with. So we had a different collection of clones and vineyard management, layout, and we created a whole new cuvée around that was sort of the next generation of Le Cadeau products, and I named it Merci, which was my way of saying thank you to all of the people that made it possible. And there's too many of them to really even count, but I mean, obviously Daniel Roberts was among them, David Ramey, who introduced me. I learned along the way that with Some of the heirloom clones, Mary Edwards down in California, had been instrumental in taking cuttings from Mount Eden and putting them into UC Davis and getting the viruses out. Rod Berglund at Swan, Larry Hyde, I mean, these are all people that had their fingerprints on heirloom clones or heritage clones in one way or another. And, you know, and frankly, I'd be really remiss if I didn't mention Tony Soter, because as a wine collector, one of the real aha moments to me that helped me understand plant material, I mean, part of it was regional, but when Tony was involved at Etude down in California, he made a Pinot Noir called Heirloom. And he was always quite tight-lipped on multiple occasions about actually what was in it. But, you know, it was basically a collection of plant material that did not include the usual suspects that we were growing up here. And you know, kind of like a news reporter interviewing a politician, I asked him one day, I said, well, if you had Calera, Swan, Mount Eden, would you be in the right ballpark? He said, yeah, you'd have it covered pretty well, you know, but leaving the door open for some other magic clones that he'd come across that he rightfully chose not to talk about. But, you know, the wine was fantastic, and it aged really well. I mean, I recently opened a bottle that was 20 years old, and it was fantastic wine. And of course, you know, Tony's an amazing winemaker, but, you know, he was also, I think, very forward-thinking in the development of that product. And it, I think, helped me in that phase of wine collecting understand that there were different ways of going about things, and that vanilla wasn't necessarily going to get me where I wanted to be. So Merci was really my second generation project, if you will, where I brought together all of these different things that, you know, being in the business for about 10 years at that point, as both a grower and a collector and a collaborator on the winemaking side of things, that all came together really in that one wine. You know, how does it differentiate? Well, immediately, I mean, Merci has a different aromatic profile than the other wines. It's much more floral, and I can only conclude that that is plant material related, clonally related, because the same winemakers do the same thing with the other plants from the same vineyard, and they don't come out the same way. So there's something there that I think is unique and interesting, and the critics have been fond of that wine as well. It consistently does usually a point or two better than the others. So I think that was a good learning experience. Along the way, again, with my wine collector hat on, I was finding that personally, I was enjoying wines that had fairly high percentages of whole cluster fermentation. When I collected, I used to drink a lot of Italian wines, and you know, if they have enough tannin to peel the enamel off your teeth, it's okay. You know, it's not all bad. It's hard to sell that wine to everybody because most people like to keep the enamel on their teeth. But I liked the spicy, slightly herbal character, and especially the aromatics that you would get out of whole cluster. And so Steve Ryan and I created a wine called Trajectory, Journey, Path, a new adventure, and basically did 100% whole cluster. Did it in a 2-ton wood tank. Steve had oriented down in California very much in a biodynamic direction, and so the idea of doing a whole cluster wood tank, native yeast, throw it in, make it happen, let the grapes do their thing, was very appealing to Steve. But it was really funny because he hadn't done a whole cluster wine before, and we did 100% whole cluster, and so basically he looked in the top of the tank and he saw a produce stand. You know, there was no juice. And he turned to me, he goes, now what do I do? And I said, well, hey, you're the winemaker, you figure it out. But it's not the first whole cluster wine that we've ever made. And so he learned to, you know, obviously with that much weight on the fruit, the bottom ones get crushed, and he got a little juice off and started doing pump overs, and you know, it's worked well. But so, you know, the next second generation wine that we created was Treget. And then, and that's been interesting, and being 100% whole cluster, it's quite a different product. And I use a little bit of the heritage clone plant material, about 50-50 with the other material. So it's different not only from a whole cluster standpoint, but also plant material. And the last phase, really, I'd call it phase 3, is back in 2015. I was still kind of trying to figure out if there was more to grab. You know, what had we left on the table? And although Steve and Jim are super smart people and fantastic winemakers, and collectively between the two of them, they have like 60 years of winemaking experience. You know, when I'm out on the road, people always ask me if I'm the winemaker, and I usually say, no, I'm the winemaker antagonist. And about that time, I brought in Pierre Millman, who is kind of like Google for wine. You know, you send him an email with a question and you get this incredible answer back. It's great. And but it's not free. It's unfortunately where it separates from Google. But I brought Pierre in 2015, and you know, Steve and Jim were both kind of like, well, what do we need a French consultant for? I mean, we're making great wine, and you know, why is this a good idea? And what I really was very, very curious about, and what caused me, in part at least, to be interested in working with Pierre, is that I had read a number of reviews from Alan Meadows, Berghound, probably going back 5 years or so. And as you're prone to do, you know, I just said, well, what's he giving big scores to, and what do those reviews say? And it's not so much that I was interested in making or tailoring a wine that made Alan happy. It was more about, what is Alan looking for in Pinot Noir? And what I really was intrigued by is that anything that he gave a good score to, about half of the review was about aromatics. I mean, it was almost like, you know, for Alan, if a wine didn't niff good, you know, you just take 3 points off of it. You know, it could have whatever kind of taste you wanted, but for him, it wasn't a Pinot Noir experience. And again, not everybody has to agree with that, but it was very, very clear to me that aromatics was something that Alan Meadows saw as being a major, major, major factor in high-quality Pinot Noir. And I began thinking, what do I really know about aromatics? What do I know about the cause and effect creation of aromatics? And, you know, I had come to understand many different variables in the vineyard and in the winery. You know, I knew what the rocky soil did. I knew what different clones did. I knew what cold temperatures and earlier late picks did. I knew what heavily toasted barrels, and I knew what different coopers, and you know, there's lots and lots of variables. And I had a pretty good understanding of the cause and effect between those variables. But when it came to aromatics, it was kind of like catching lightning. You know, it's like, where does aromatics come from, and how does it originate, and why does one barrel smell really good and the other barrel doesn't smell at all, or it smells like, you know, old shoes or whatever, you know? What's driving all of this? And I felt like I wasn't really getting those answers from Steve and Jim. And I felt like maybe Pierre, who's very analytical and much more, I would say, maybe lab-oriented in his approach to making wine, but also, you know, multiple generations. And, and Pierre consulted with Angelo Gaia and Dujac and Elena Walsh and some of, fantastic names around the world. And I thought, not only can I get Pierre's input on aromatics, but I can also get input into what the very best sellers in the world are doing. And so we brought on Pierre, and initially Steve and Jim were quite apprehensive, as you might well imagine. I mean, they weren't young, learning winemakers. They were winemakers that had matured into their own protocols, and they were in their own groove. And so there was a lot of curiosity as to what a Pierre wine would really look like. And one of the ways that I solved that problem was we were having a meeting, and it was 2016, which was really, I brought Pierre in 2015, but he came in late in the season, and Steve and Jim were both kind of wrapped up doing what they were doing. And so Pierre's input was fairly minimal. By the time 2016 came around, we were having a planning meeting, and Pierre said, look, I'm not here to tell you guys how to make wine. You've been making wine for years, you know how to make wine. I'm here to help you make the wine you want to make. So you tell me what you guys are trying to do, and I'll give you my input, and you can decide whether you want to use it or not. And I thought, that all sounds great, but I'm the guy paying to fly Pierre over here, and now I've got two gatekeepers who are going to decide that they don't like what Pierre's saying and they're going to throw it all out. Or not, or maybe, But I was curious, what would a Pierre wine look like? And so I said to Steve and Jim, okay, so here's what we're going to do. Pierre's going to tell me what he would like for fruit characteristics. And I'm going to pick a ton or a ton and a half, basically a small tank of fruit for each of you guys to Pierre's characteristics. And then on that one tank, I want Pierre to tell you what he would do, and I want you to do it exactly the way Pierre says to do it. And let's see what a Pierre wine looks like. And if it sucks, it's on me. It's my fruit, it's my money. I got to sell this stuff, so you got no downside here. Let's just go through this one tank and see what Pierre would do. And it actually worked out really, really well, because the alternative approach would be to have Pierre influence their winemaking, and there would be this constant tension between whether they wanted to try something new and how far they wanted to go, and did they want to do it all or part of it, and we went through all of those procedures. I mean, we worked with Pierre for 7 years, and as the relationship developed, there was greater and greater mutual respect and a sharing of ideas. But the Pierre tanks were always quite interesting, because the first tank in 2016, when the grapes finished fermenting, the wine that came out was pink, and it looked like, it tasted like grapefruit juice. I mean, Pierre wanted to pick really early, and the acids were high, and the sugars were quite low, and it took years for that wine to evolve. It ultimately evolved very nicely. Recently, about 6 months or so ago, I had a guy come into the tasting room here from Switzerland. And, he clearly had a European palate, and he was tasting wine, and he goes, yeah, they're pretty good. And I said, well, here, try a bottle of this. And I gave him a bottle of the 2016, which at that point, we're looking at 7 years or so. And he said, oh yeah, that's the way I want my wine. This is, not as much fruit, there's more acid, there's less sugar, less alcohol. And what was interesting, though, over the course of 7 years of working with Pierre, Pierre moved a lot. He had not made wine in Oregon, and I think he learned what a lot of the early Oregon winemakers had learned themselves, which is Oregon is not Burgundy. And that by the time we finished the run with Pierre, which was just a year or so ago, and it was just because he got busy on a project with his daughter, and they're making some wine in Burgundy, and he just kind of ran out of time. And I think we felt like after 7 years we'd learned a lot of what we were going to learn from Pierre. So it was a good time to just go back on our own. And so now it's me and Steve and Jim, but we've all been influenced by Pierre. But by the time Pierre finished, when he first got here, a good Burgundy had to be around 13%. And by the time we finished, he's like, nah, if it's got to be 14.1, that's okay. I mean, I don't want to be at 14.5, but, you got to let the fruit get ripe so you've got the flavor and you got the layers and you got the richness. And, you want your acids right. You want it to be in balance, as he would like to say. And, but we all learned a lot. Pierre learned a lot. We learned a lot. And I think, again, back to what I was saying earlier, that's what makes wine unique and special. You never finish learning. It's just a constant cycle.
You talked a little earlier about the difference in selling wine versus selling other things you'd sold in your life. So tell me about, as you started to have wine and you needed to sell wine, tell me about learning how to sell it and learning how to sort of be comfortable selling it in a different way than previous products.
Yeah, well, there's kind of a funny phenomena that goes on. Everybody likes to say scores don't matter, but it's funny how you always run out of wine with good scores. But they don't matter, But, it goes back to really what I was talking about earlier with people developing palates. And, there's, in the group of consumers that are interested enough in wine to appreciate, want, and respect and have the wherewithal to find good wine and take the time to seek out good wine, that's a meaningful part of our target customer base. And a lot of those people want to be told what good wine is, and so they frequently look for scores, because it's an easy way to sift through literally thousands of different products and narrow it down to a handful that they want to give their time and money to. But I think that what we've also come to realize with the different cuvées that we make is that there are a lot of different palates there, that people like certain things. And some people are like the Swiss guy that came in and he wanted a very old world, low alcohol, high acid, much more elegant expression of Pinot Noir. And then there's other people that'll come in and they go, I'm a cab drinker and I don't really like Pinot. And, it's like, okay, here, try this 2015 that, has 14.8 alcohol in it and see, oh, that's pretty good. I've never had a Pinot like this, Okay, well, good. So, there's a range. And the thing about Pinot Noir is that it can express itself in so many different ways. And I think that with the different cuvées, we've found that we don't necessarily engineer or try to build the wines to meet certain palates, but the different clones and the different soils and cuvées and the different picking times and the way we do things in the winery, we ultimately end up with a collection of wines that when I do wine dinners, and, maybe we'll be tasting Côte d'Est, Diversité, Rochot, and Merci. There might be 4 Pinots on the table at a dinner, and I'll usually have everybody vote at the end of the night. Raise hands if Côte d'Est was your favorite or whatever. And, it varies from dinner to dinner and place to place, but most often we get fairly equal distributions between the various wines. Early on, we had a tasting going on, and to illustrate the point, we had a whole bunch of our wines lined up. I think there were 10 or 12 of them, and there were a husband and wife couple that had tasted through all the wines. And the husband said to the wife, what do you think? She goes, I really like all these wines, they're great. And he said, should we get some? And she said, yeah, let's get a case. And she said to him, which one do you like? He goes, well, I really like Rochot. And he said, what about you? He goes, well, I really like Côte d'Est. she turns to me and she says, okay, give us a case with 11 bottles of Codest and 1 bottle of Rochelle. That's a true story, okay? So, you know, people have different palates and they have different attitudes and different views on things. Selling wine, in part, is catering to that. Selling wine, in part, is also recognizing that there's a wide range of consumers that are in different places on their wine journey. You know, some just want a good bottle of wine and they don't really care about anything. In some cases, not even the price. Just, you know, I just want a good bottle of wine. You know, let's not over-engineer this. And then there's other people that want to split every hair all the way down to, you know, anything you can tell them, and that's still not enough. But then, of course, you get into the different levels of distribution and or paths to market, if you will. And, you know, we're sitting here in the tasting room. Obviously, this is a direct-to-consumer location. You know, like everybody else, we have a wine club. But unlike a lot of smaller Oregon wineries, we only do 1,500 cases of Le Cadeau. We have another brand, Jolete, that's about the same size, maybe a little bit bigger. But the Le Cadeau is all 100% estate fruit, and that's really our primary focus. And the distribution thing is interesting because I always had a day job, and I was traveling, and we lived in Minneapolis, and so I would be running around meeting with customers in various cities around the country, and would do that by day, and by night I would go into a wine shop and have a conversation with somebody or a restaurant and say, hey, who's a good distributor in this market? And I'd get a list of names and tried to set up distribution in places where mostly I wanted to go or had to go. So, you know, we like to ski, so Colorado was a first market. We were living in Minneapolis, and so we had that market. I'm from Chicago, we had that market. My wife's from Philly, so we set up the East Coast markets. And so for a very, very small winery, when we were getting started, we had a much greater distribution focus than a lot of the smaller, much more regional wineries in Oregon. And so what happened from that is we would frequently find people coming to us in Oregon, and they were kind of like two different types of customers. One would be a customer that maybe had our wine in New York City, and they were taking a wine trip to Oregon, and they intentionally looked us up because they'd have our wine. And to this day, we'll have people stumble into the tasting room and go, oh, look, Cadeau, are you brand new? I've never heard of you. And, you know, it's because a lot of our wine gets sold outside of Oregon and always has. And so what I've come to appreciate about the wine market is it's just highly fragmented. And my wife and I have spent a lot of time in the market, both at distribution level, but also here at the tasting room and with the wine club and online and the whole thing. And, you know, nothing that we've done that everybody else hasn't done. But for a small winery, you know, we've gone through the different phases. I mean, when we got started, at the very beginning, you know, online, there were 2 or 3 forums, and there weren't really transactions going on. Wine clubs hadn't gotten started, and so we've watched the wine evolution evolve. And, you know, and more recently, to a certain extent, wine has almost morphed into the entertainment business, which, to be very honest, is a direction that we maybe are willing to put a toe in, but not a foot. You know, because what we're all about is making great wine, and that's what I want to put my time and energy into. And I'm not all about hosting great parties and, you know, hiring every musician that I can hire to try to get people to come see us. There's a time and a place, and I'm not saying that we won't do that, but it's not the focus. What I try to do, and part of the reason we've maintained a distribution profile, and a lot of people have, more recently have said to me, why are you even distributing at all? I mean, 1,500 cases, you should be selling all of that wine direct. But there's a good argument for that. But we meet our customers by having our wine in the marketplace. And so, if we can be at a great country club in Houston and members can experience our wine at their country club, if we're in Florida, and just a couple weeks ago we did a big wine event at the Seaside Festival on the Panhandle, which is a great event, and we met some new customers there. But there wouldn't be a reason to go to Seaside if we didn't have distribution in Florida, because the whole event is put together in concert really with our distributor primarily. There are just places that you want to be, that you want to reach, customers, clients that are very difficult to reach without being distributed. The Blue Ridge Mountains, where everybody from Atlanta and Charlotte goes for their summer vacations, and it's pretty spectacular clubs and residences, and the ski areas in Colorado. I mean, those are places where $80 bottles of wine are cheap, and those are places where you want to be. But there are 350 million cases of wine or so sold in the U.S. every year, and Oregon makes less than 1% of that, and Oregon Pinot is half of that, roughly, and high-end Oregon Pinot, you can slice the wedge down even further. So, the thing is, when you're making small production, high-quality boutique Pinot Noir, our customers are slivers in hay piles. And so the question is, how do you find those customers that appreciate what you're doing? And our approach to that has been more about being in distribution markets and being in places where those customers tend to congregate, as opposed to going down the entertainment path where we lure a whole bunch of people to our site, and hopefully we catch a few in the net.
So we've talked about kind of your personal journey in the industry. Tell us a little bit about Oregon wine industry. You talked a little bit about kind of your initial impressions of it. How have you seen Oregon wine grow and change in the time you've been in it, and what does the industry look like now at the end of 2023?
Well, huge changes. Of course, the changes are filtered by my own changes. When I first came out here, I was 40, and now I'm not even going to tell you, but it's add 25 or more. And I think your perspectives change as an individual as you get older. But the industry has clearly been a huge moving target. When we first came here, my perception as a wine collector that didn't know the industry comprehensively, but my perception was that there were probably 20 or 25 wineries in Oregon that kind of had the magic formula, that had vineyards in the right place, the right fruit planted, they were farming it the right way, that they were consistently turning out a pretty good product. My perception was also, though, that there were some huge vintages, even among some of the better, huge variations among the vintages, even from some of those better producers. And what I see today is much, much more uniformity. There's still some duds, you know. I mean, it's not like every wine made in Oregon is fantastic, you know, but there's I think a much higher bar and consistency, and there are far, far more producers that know how to make great wine, and big and small, and so in that regard, there's a little more predictability, I think, of the products that we're putting out. Certainly, the volumes have changed. I mean, when you look at the history of Oregon and you listen to the folks that have been doing this for 40 or going back 50 years, I mean, they were running around the country trying to get people to even believe that an Oregon wine was worth drinking, you know, in a good wine shop or a good restaurant. And, you know, I came in, you know, my first commercial products hit the market in 2004 or so. 2002 vintage was the first Cadeau wine that I was actually out selling. And, you know, in 04, 05, 06, 07, Oregon was being widely discovered, and there weren't that many producers, and it was almost like ring the dinner bell and yell, come and get it. And if you were making a decent wine, distributors were going to buy pallets. I mean, because there was more demand than there were producers, and Oregon, I think, had gotten dialed in by the mid-2000s to the point where the wines were more uniformly good. And I think also, you know, we were seeing improvements in packaging and labeling, and, you know, there was more of a commercial industry here that wasn't as local farm sort of early on, which is kind of what it was. At least that would be kind of my perspective on it. And so, yeah, I think, you know, where we're at now is difficult for, well, it's a difficult place to enter. Mm-hmm. Doctors, lawyers, business people, engineers, whatever their trade is, that brings them to the Oregon wine industry, they have a tendency to go brain dead when they get here, and they forget all of the business principles that they learned in their day job in the first part of their career. And what I mean by that is not to be insulting, but to rather suggest that there's kind of this mentality that there's this unlimited market for wine and grapes. And, you know, I was in Colorado meeting with a guy who's been in the restaurant business for many years, and he was the wine manager, and he was telling me about a hedge fund manager who had an office across the street, and the hedge fund manager had a client, and the client had just inherited 110 acres of potential vineyard property in Oregon, and it was in a good location. And the hedge fund manager was working with the client to kind of finance it, and was asking the restaurant guy to consult because they were going to plant 110 acres of grapes. And I said, has anybody thought about who might actually buy those? I mean, is there a marketing plan? And so what tends to happen, and what has happened as Oregon has caught some fire over the last, 20 years, is that you have more and more people who fall in love with the beauty, become passionate and fall in love with the wine, fall in love with the idea of making wine, and are frequently very smart, very experienced people, but they go brain dead when it comes to getting into the business. Now, the thing is, because they're smart and they're experienced and they usually have some wherewithal, they survive all of that. And after a period of 5 or 10 years, they become smart contributors, and they learn how to operate the business, and they understand the ins and outs. But You know, it's a different world here than it was 20 years ago. And there's always room for somebody that is going to come do something great and big and different, or small and different. You know, Oregon is a place where small exists very well, and that's something that is, I think, very appealing to Oregon. But you also have to be smart about it. And it's not, you know, the folks that started the industry, you know, 50 or so years ago, worked their tails off, but they were painting a blank piece of paper. And they did a fantastic job with what they built. I was fortunate because I came in at a time where that piece of paper had largely been painted and sketched, but it hadn't been fully developed. And so over the 20 years, I got to ride on their coattails without having to create an industry. I got to come into an industry that had been substantially created and to ride the wave along with that. But you know, now you've got an industry that is much bigger and much more competitive and much more populated. And oppositely, you know, in the distribution market, there's a lot more consolidation. There are bigger distributors that are serving bigger winery conglomerates, and there's, you know, there's widely varied cost structures throughout the industry, and so figuring out how to play and where to play and doing it intelligently, you know, takes some time and planning. But you know, all that aside, it's a lot of fun.
So what comes next for the industry, and what comes next for you?
Well, I think for the industry, you know, at the risk of being sort of trite, I think we're going to see further extensions of what we've already seen. You know, we're going to see some bigger houses with big, deep pockets that will come in and make Oregon a meaningful part of a wine portfolio that's probably global in many cases. And we've certainly seen that. I mean, you know, there are a number of French players, and we've got a few Italian players now that have recently come in, and for some time, we've had some significant California players here. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. And I think that, you know, you have to ask the question, why? Well, first of all, there's a lot of land here, and the vast majority of it's still covered with fir trees or hazelnuts or something like that. So, you know, you're not taking residential land away from people, and of course Oregon was fairly proactive in their zoning laws that left desirable agricultural property available for agriculture. And so there's a zoning structural framework that I think plays to land availability, but I think Oregon is also a place where, you know, unlike California, where there are a number of forces, both economic and political, and probably all kinds of other forces, that in many cases will oppose vineyard development. I think in Oregon it's still respected, appreciated, and considered desirable. And so you don't run into all of those political or zoning barriers that you run into in other parts of the country. I think that arguably climate change has made Oregon a more desirable place to grow and plant grapes. I think my personal view is that climate change is moving slowly, but I mean, it's very real, but it's incremental. And, you know, when I planted the property, you know, Alan Holstein, who is, the guy that told me that Grand Cru vineyards are planted in every which way and hadn't read the book on north-south road direction, I said, what do you think about my site? And he said, well, you're at 700 feet. You're a little high. You're probably not, you're going to have years where you're not going to get your fruit ripe. Well, I'd like to say I was brilliant and I saw all of this coming, and, 700, 750 feet, I'm kind of right where I want to be right now. And so, 20 years ago, Alan was telling me I'd have a problem with ripeness in probably 3 to 5 out of 10 years. And I don't have any ripeness problems now. And so, other varietals being viable. I know early on a lot of the pioneers tried to plant Merlot and had, not very favorable outcomes. I think that we might be in a place where we can begin to revisit some of those varietals. And I think that farming practices have evolved that make higher elevation sites viable. I mean, of course, it's gotten warmer, but I think that people that like the high acid, low alcohol style of Pinot Noir, we're going to see people planting at 900 or 1,000 feet, which would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. And so I think, answering your question on a very broad basis, I think we're going to see some diversification of varietals, which of course will factor into wine products. We've got a friendly growing environment where land is affordable. We got plenty of water, which is kind of a big deal. Grapes like water. And although not much, they're not water hogs, so that's a good thing. And so the climate is, when I say climate, I don't mean the weather climate, but the commercial environment for wine in Oregon is robust. And I think it favors a migration, or at least an involvement of people that are big in the wine business. I mean, I mentioned earlier, there's 350 million cases or so, and that's old data. Maybe there's 400 million cases in the U.S. It's probably closer to that number. But whether it's 350 or 400 million cases of wine sold in the U.S. every year, it's a whole lot more than they grow in Oregon and produce in Oregon. And globally, there are over 3 billion cases of wine made every year. And that's a lot of stuff. And what happens with the wine industry is as it grows, it brings the support services with it. So you get label printers, you get glass distributors, and then eventually you get glass manufacturers, and you get, farm equipment people, and they become big farm equipment people, and, you've got tanks, and you've got wine construction, you've got winery construction, you've got architects. And then, of course, all the restaurants come in on the back end. And so you see an evolution. I mean, you can look to places like California to see how wine has evolved and what effect it has on the community. And I think that, Oregon's in a place where we're going to see that sort of an evolution. It's very, very clear that you can grow good fruit in Oregon. It's very clear that climate change is opening up the door to other varietals. It's very clear that Oregon Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are world class, and certainly Pinot Gris and Riesling and some others can play in that game as well. So I think we're going to see more of the same. There's a trend that's been started, and it's just going to keep going.
And what about for you and your brand?
Well, there was a place probably 10 years or so ago when I was, still looking to the future and seeing what at the time looked to be closer to an unlimited runway. Of course, none of us have unlimited runways, but if you're fortunate, you don't fully comprehend that until later. And I think, early on, when you're, if you're 20 or 30 or 40, you just, everything's forward. But going back about 10 years ago, I thought, it'd be fun to have another vineyard. I mean, in all of the things I love doing in the wine business, to me, the viticultural side of it is the most interesting. I love developing vineyards. I love the clones, and I love vineyard strategy, which is something that you don't hear a lot about, really, but in every aspect of the wine business, there's a strategy. And the vineyard strategy piece is very interesting. And I thought about having another property. And what I've seen over the years is that the bigger you get, you diffuse your focus. And I felt that would be at odds with my goal of trying to make the very, very best possible wines that we could make. We have about 17 acres planted. Typical yields, that's 2,800 cases. And, 10 years or so ago at that point in time, I really made a decision to try to wring every bit of quality out of what we currently have and to be better and stay small than to be bigger and diffuse my resources, whether they be just, physical or monetary or intellectual or capacity, whatever they are. But also in the vineyard level, everything moves at a glacial pace. Early on when I was just getting started, Matt Kinney, who is just down the road from me, and was kind of one of these early do everything yourself kind of guys. We were tasting wine 20 years ago, and he was pretty young at the time, and he said, in the wine business, you only get to do it once a year. And so you got to make every year count because you only get so many years. And, I've always remembered that. It seemed a little strange to me at the time because I'm talking about sort of your life perspective runway, and when you're 40, you see it as unlimited. And so to be thinking about only getting so many years, but one of the things in the wine business is because you put a date on every bottle you make and you get to watch the vintages, time is a huge part of the process. And you become, I think, keenly aware of time. And so, for me, what has been really, really interesting, I'm excited in that I've got a new clone that I've been working on getting for 5 years. And I'm about 99.9% certain that I have the first of this clone in Oregon. And it's clean for all you people that are watching that are worrying about viruses and things of that sort. And I don't know what it's going to do. It comes from an interesting reputation, and it's Pinot Noir, and we'll see the first fruit from it this year. And I don't know what the flavor profile is going to be, and I don't know if it'll be great or if it'll be a dud. But it's like clone 18 or 19. I'm not sure what number I'm up to right now, but something like that. But there's always another dial to turn or an adjustment to make. We're playing with some different footprints on vineyard spacing, and I'm looking at things to try to mitigate vigor in the few parts of the vineyard where I actually have any vigor. But there's two little areas. There are kind of these two little bumps that have deep soil that's quite fertile. I call them the camel humps. And I've ripped out vines and replanted the camel humps, and that was a few years ago, but there's still a piece of a camel hump that hasn't been planted, and so there's a footprint and a rootstock combination that I want to try on the camel hump to see, if you can grow devigorated vines on highly vigorous soils. You know, there's always more. And so I think for me, it's really about working. I don't have a lot of extra dirt to plant. There is some. But it's about fine-tuning our plant material, fine-tuning our footprint, growing hopefully amazing fruit, and then continuing to build on the knowledge base that we have in the winery to turn that into what I hope will be, you know, memorable world-class wines. And we just keep trying to move the bar.
All right. That's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to cover today?
Nah, well, you know, it's probably a little geeky, but I hinted at the notion earlier about rocks. And what I knew early on is that there's a fairly high correlation between great wine and rocky vineyards around the world. It's not to say that there isn't great wine from non-rocky vineyards, because there is. But a lot of the great wines come from rocky vineyards. And one of the things that looking, you know, stuff when you understand it, you kind of get the duh effect afterwards. It's like, oh, why didn't I figure that out earlier? You know, because it just seems pretty obvious, you know. But the thing about Oregon and rocks is that we get 40 inches of rain between November and early June. And if you have spongy soils that absorb moisture, you're taking 40 inches of rain and saturating the topsoil, and you end up with a tremendous amount of water in the soil. And the vines grow pretty much throughout the season with access to more or less an unlimited amount of water, because their toes can go in the rootstock and can pull it out because it's there. If you think about when clusters begin to form, you know, we have bud break in April, we have bloom usually around June 10th, and so you start to see some berries beginning to form towards the end of June, and throughout July and early August, the clusters are beginning to form, and then they're filling out throughout August and on into September. What I've seen over the years is that in the rockier parts of our vineyard, we get to a deficit irrigation place in early July. I'll start to see vines beginning to shut down, and if I don't irrigate them minimally, we don't do a lot of irrigation, but if I don't give them just enough of a drink to keep them growing, we'll end up with vines that have shoots that don't even reach the top of the wire. And if you think about that during the cluster formation period that happens basically from late June through kind of mid-August, that's the time when, if you don't have water, you're going to end up with smaller clusters, smaller berries, less vigor, and oppositely, if you've got vines that have access to unlimited amounts of water, they're going to grow bigger berries, bigger clusters, and you're going to end up with very different fruit. And so a lot of the rock question, I think, apart from the mineral that influences the flavors, but when you look at the growth and the development, the growth of the vines and the development of fruit clusters, and you look at that vis-a-vis the water table and what's available to the vine naturally, and the timing on when those clusters develop, what you quickly see is that if you're getting rid of that 40 inches of rain by early or mid-July, you're going to end up with a different type of fruit at the end of the season. And that's been kind of a big aha, and that, you know, it shouldn't be. It's one of those things that when you explain it and you look back on it, you just kind of go, well, yeah, of course, you know. But rocks matter. And again, I'm not saying that great wine isn't made on vineyards that aren't rocky. That's not the message. But I think if I've learned anything in 25 years, it's that we have a pretty unique site that is differentiated from a lot of sites in Oregon, and a big part of that's the rock.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today, sharing your story, sharing your beautiful space here and the beautiful picture behind you there for us to stare at. Go ahead and let you off the hook. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys.